This idea was that, children were under threat from homosexuals. And that was successful in Miami. The first moment in which that happened in 1977, where there was this real sort of recognition that anti-gay politics could actually do pretty well in the nation. There was this idea that homosexuals, like communists, had infiltrated their way into the federal government and that they were a threat to the nation. We should have a national database that names every homosexual in the country, and we should track them and keep, and some of the proposals they should be quarantined, or they should get tattoos. Like, really awful stuff is being debated within the White House.
I wanted to get into the things you discussed in the book, starting with what is the first marker in history for the movement of quote unquote the gay Republican, LGBTQ Republicans? When do you discuss this movement kind of beginning within the Republican Party?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the beginning point of what would be a visible, recognizable movement of gay Republicans happens in like 1977, 1978. And it begins here in California, where I live, because there was the ballot initiative called Proposition 6, or what was more commonly known as the Briggs Initiative. It was put forward by this conservative state legislator from Orange County, California, named John Briggs. And it went on the 1978 ballot. And had it passed, it would have made it illegal for any gay or lesbian person to work in California's public school system. And so when that ballot initiative got proposed, dozens of gay Republicans, mostly in San Francisco, but also in the Los Angeles area, started coming out of the closet. They started organizing, and they created these grassroots organizations to defeat the Briggs Initiative, and also to show the Republican Party that, hey, we belong to your party. We're already Republicans, and to push back on this, at the time, this very early stage of the religious right.
So yeah, you spoke about Proposition 6, and that's good because I did want to ask you if you could go into maybe if there's any others, or you could go more into that of some of these laws that were weaponized against the LGBTQ community at the time. I know it's probably mostly the like homosexual community. Like in what ways were these laws used to target them?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because California was building on something that happened in South Florida, in Miami. In the mid 1970s, a bunch of mostly like liberal cities had begun passing these non-discrimination ordinances that included, for the first time ever, sexual orientation. And most of this was going sort of under the radar because it was happening in places like Ann Arbor, Michigan, and liberal university towns. But Miami-Dade County was one of the locations that passed a non-discrimination bill. And Anita Bryant, who was this far-right conservative gospel singer, she'd been a beauty pageant queen. She lived in Miami, and she became aware of what had happened there through her pastor. And so she launched this campaign to have it overturned. And it was called Save Our Children, because this idea was that, children were under threat from homosexuals. And that was successful in Miami. And it was the first moment in which, and that happened in 1977, where there was this real sort of recognition that anti-gay politics could actually do pretty well in the nation. Anita Bryant became, hugely important in conservative politics because of what she accomplished in Miami. And John Briggs in California said, I'm gonna, repeat that here in the state of California. And you see this sort of escalate in the 1980s and really become a sort of strategy at the national level with, Reagan Republicans, obviously the Reagan White House, and sort of the National Republican Party through the 1980s.
I think that not much has changed in that regard then, because you still
No,
hear a lot of, they're going after the children and these kinds of
right.
things used in the political sphere today. I think another figure who is probably, at least to my belief, would be important to kind of things around this time would be J. Edgar Hoover. Could you kind of speak to him in relation to the movement around this period?
Yeah, so J. Edgar Hoover's sort of a much more important figure a little bit earlier on. I mean, really sort of in the mid 20th century. Obviously, I think probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with him, the role that he played in really cracking down on homosexuals during the mid 20th century. In this era of the Cold War, a lot of historians refer to it as the Lavender Scare, because the federal government was dedicating so much of its power to finding homosexuals, first in the State Department, right? There was this idea that homosexuals, like communists, had infiltrated their way into the federal government and that they were a threat to the nation. And J. Edgar Hoover, heading up the FBI, was committed to this work. Now, of course, most historians believe that he was a closeted homosexual himself. And so there's a sort of interesting psychology at work there. Like, is this guy a self-loathing homosexual who is giving all this political effort to ruining other homosexuals' lives because of his own tortured, self? Like, historians have weighed in on that. But I think what's really important to understand is the way in which he was part of an enormous apparatus and really an enormous federal project directed at gay and lesbians in mid-century America. I mean, people were thousands and thousands of homosexuals were arrested, had their lives ruined in the 1950s and 1960s because of these fears about the Lavender Scare and this idea that homosexuals were the greatest deviants in the nation. And because they were deviants, they were the most likely to turn into communist and to betray their country. And I think it's important to know that it wasn't just straight politicians who were creating this political scare, but there were homosexuals that were involved in it as well, such as Hoover.
And not to, I guess, discount lesbians or how this could have affected women as well, but
Yeah,
something I've noticed is a lot of times the focus is directed towards men, at least in the rhetoric kind of things, which I think you can draw parallels to even today, especially with like attacks on trans women and these kinds of things, where it's like a constant debate around masculinity and how people don't like when it feels threatened. Could you kind of speak to how that is in relation to the movement back then?
absolutely. I think that's such a smart observation and a really important question because so in the 1950s, this idea was that again, America was under attack from, from communist Russia, and that the US had to be the strongest nation in the world in order to defeat communism and to protect itself. And so notions of masculinity are tied up in these ideas about state and national power, right? You can't have weak men, and what's weaker than a homosexual? So there's that stuff that's going on. But in terms of like men are much more sort of subjected to this than, or gay men are much more subjected to this than lesbian women. I mean, partly it's because gay men tended to live a little bit more visible lives. So they were more likely to go to gay bars. They were more likely to meet one another for sex in parks or public restrooms. They just were much more vulnerable in their visibility, and so they were easier to target by federal officials and also local law enforcement. But again, I think your point is really important here that this idea of weak men and effeminate men was perceived as a threat to the nation, even as they also imagined the homosexual as this sexual predator, right? Who is going to, go after children and all that. And we can draw a straight line, as you suggested, to recent panics around groomers, right? And the don't say gay bill stuff. This idea of like, again, I think it's more that men represent a threat to children in the classroom because they're going to groom them into homosexuality or now into like gender dysphoria. And also the threat of trans women in athletic sports.
I was wondering if you could go into some of these kind of reactionary elements we were seeing at the time. I know a big one that a lot of people point to is Ronald Reagan saying like HIV is God's will and that kind of thing. But I'm also curious if there were any others and maybe the role that that played in shaping the GOP to what we know it as today.
Yeah, so the HIV AIDS crisis of the 1980s is enormous here, and really it shapes, I think, all of the reactionary politics that does develop, especially on the right in the 80s and leading into the 1990s. Um, Reagan famously doesn't ever say HIV or AIDS until his second administration. And actually, it's really late into the presidency. I think it's 1987 when he first even says it. So he's almost done as president. By then, thousands and thousands of Americans have died, and many, many more have contracted the disease. But what's really developing on the right, and Reagan, I think historians have rightly criticized the sort of lack of response from the president himself. But one of the things that I show, and I think some other historians have shown, is actually it could have been a lot worse because the people he had working in his administration, such as Patrick Buchanan, um, and a couple of others are these crazy right wingers, crazy homophobes, and the memos that they're drawing up in the White House of what they want the president to do are awful. So everything from, we should have a national database that names every homosexual in the country and we should track them and keep, and some of the proposals they should be quarantined, or they should get tattoos. Like really awful stuff is being debated within the White House. Reagan doesn't take any of these things up, so I guess it could have been a lot worse. But I think all of that speaks to a really, really anti-gay, really homophobic politics, that is taking shape in the 1980s that goes into the 1990s. And then we see that shaping things like, military policy around, keeping the gay ban in place, and other sort of vicious, really homophobic politics, that I think really characterizes the Republican Party of the 1990s.
I did want to get to today for this next question, kind of, and I think that Trumpism could be sort of to blame, I guess, for the more reactionary parts of it, with politicians like Ron DeSantis comes to mind with the "Don't Say Gay" law and this kind of things, as we and with the normalization of even more anti-LGBTQ rhetoric than has been in. I guess recent years, probably more so akin to back in like the 80s and such, like we were
Yes.
speaking of. What do you think of this moment in the history, I guess, of the movement? What do you think it speaks to that we're kind of back at this point now?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question. It's really the moment that we're in, right? The way in which the sort of anti-trans politics, especially in the 2022 midterms, and I think even we're seeing, in this election, particularly in certain states, is like at the forefront of Republican strategy for winning. Um, and I think, the thing that my book shows really in the sort of last chapter of it, because I was finishing up the book right when the 2022 midterm elections were taking place, was I think the difference here is the way in which gay Republicans and log cabin Republicans have actually accommodated a lot of this anti-trans development. Now, they argue that especially log cabin Republicans, says they support trans rights and by that they mean any adult should be able to live any way they want to. And they say what they oppose or are what they call the radical gender ideology being forced on the nation's children. And I think that that's a position that actually a lot of Americans align with. I mean, if you look at polling around this issue, it becomes sort of complicated, in terms of like, what do we mean when we're talking about trans rights? But the thing that I asked a lot of the and I interviewed nearly 3 dozen gay Republicans for this book, including the current president of Log Cabin Republicans, who at the time was being incredibly supportive and working closely with Governor DeSantis in Florida around the Don't Say Gay bill. And I said, are you concerned at all where this is heading? A lot of people think that this is not a distinct piece of legislation, which is only about, kindergarten through third graders, which it was the way the law was written at the time. It's now been expanded through 12th graders. And also, it served as a blueprint for other states to do much more expansive things. But I said, are you not at all concerned where this might be headed? And all of them said, oh, no, no, of course not. marriage, same-sex marriage is the law of the land. It will never be overturned. None of these other things will happen. And I think that that is a naive position. I mean, we'll see. I don't know. I'm a historian. I examine the past. I don't forecast the future.
Not a psychic,
But
right?
right, but I do think it's a legitimate question to ask, where's this headed? And are you at all concerned that you have helped some of these politicians who might have a much bigger assault on LGBTQ rights planned for the future? They don't see that as a concern, but I think, especially if Trump wins this election, um, it's a big open question of where the broader assault on LGBTQ rights is headed.